Thank you very, very much. It's great to be back at the Convict Club. I'm Michael Bossaque, and I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, also a geopolitics analyst and former journalist, South China Morning Post, Asia Times, among others. And also, I worked in an organization you probably would know about, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in 2014. I was the spokesperson in Ukraine. But one of the things I love to do the most is to moderate panels and appear on panels because there's so much to talk about. The reason my throat is a bit hoarse, I just climbed off an airplane from Singapore. Well, in the past 24 hours, I was in Asia at the Foreign Correspondents Club, iconic Foreign Correspondents Club. We too had a year ahead panel, and there was a lot of anxiety about what the year ahead holds, especially in Asia Pacific, of course, with uncertainty about where China will go, where tariffs are going to go. And Hong Kong being Hong Kong, unfortunately, in the current environment, there were certain things there that we could not talk about, which I'm happy that we can talk about here in London. We're going to have a little bit of an extended session today, given the weight of the topics. We're going to look a little bit at last year and look at the year ahead. And I promise you we'll leave at least about 20 minutes for Q&A, so please get your questions ready. And also you'll notice one of our speakers, Isa Suarez of CNN, could not be here. She sends her regrets, but given the busy news cycle at the moment, she does have a live evening show. She had to stay with that. And also, of course, thanks to On Frontline Primavera for putting this together. You know, at the FCC in Hong Kong, I tried to find some words to describe the year that we just went through. Head spinning doesn't even come close. But I will remind you that it was a year where democracy was really put to the test. 40 or so elections, I believe, and almost 50% of the world's population went to the polls. And a high percentage of those were first-time voters. So we saw lots of interesting shifts in various jurisdictions, but among the elections were, well, some of them we should put elections in quotation marks, Russia, South Africa, India, UK, USA, of course, Iran. And also, I'm currently based in Ukraine. We have lots of interesting neighbors. There was a referendum on EU membership in Moldova, and there was also a presidential election. And both of those elections were very knife-edged because the referendum just squeaked by, and also the West-leaning President Maya Sandu just squeaked through as well. If it wasn't for the diaspora vote, things might have turned out differently. And also in Georgia, a very key state, which Russia is biting away at, a pro-Russian party, Georgia Dream, was elected. But of course, we must put in the caveat that there was lots of questions about the freedom and fairness of that election. It's also a year where, in my view anyway, autocrats behaved with a lot more impunity, whether it's shooting down a civilian airliner, whether it's trying to sever submarine cables in the Baltic Sea, whether it's trying to assassinate opponents on UK or other soil. And also, a lot of autocrats learned much more about sanction busting. And that's, of course, very, very important because if you don't have useful sanctions, how are you supposed to penalize the bad guys? And I think we'll be talking a little bit about this in the panel, as they seem to be watching each other very closely, but also learning from each other quite a bit. And then finally, a whole spat of interesting elections coming up this year. We're going to see very interesting changes in my home country of Canada. We're going to see elections in Poland, a rerun of the presidential election in Romania. And that one, by the way, was because of alleged Russian influence and support of TikTok in that country that pushed a relatively unknown Putin-friendly candidate to the top. And then the chap in Belarus, Lukashenko, is also going to seek re-election. So lots more head-spinning events to look forward to. Let me quickly introduce the panel. I'll keep it short. They all have very impressive bios. You can read more about them on the website. Far right is my friend Ravi Matu. We've been on panels
Not
together.
literally on the far right, let's be clear.
On panels together. He joined the New York Times in 2022 from the FT, where he had held a number of senior roles. We crossed over a lot in Asia Pacific, where you're based in Hong Kong. And he is managing editor of the New York Times Deal Book based in London. Lots and lots of interesting content there. Encourage you to visit their site. Next is Ben Bland. He is Asia Pacific Program Director at Chatham House. By the way, we're not on Chatham House rules this evening. Research focuses on the nexus of politics, economics, and international relations in Southeast Asia, as well as China's growing role in the broader region. He was formerly with the Lowy Institute in Sydney, and author of many books, and 2 critically acclaimed books, and has also appeared a lot on major international broadcasting networks. And then a familiar face, Bianca Nobilo, who you may recognize from CNN, whether it's standing in front of 10 Downing or anchoring one of the breaking news events of the day. She, like many others, has moved on from journalism, but to take a very interesting role as Chief External Affairs Officer at IFS, where she drives thought leadership, government and industry relations, and external affairs with a focus on AI and advanced technology, ethics, and policy. And I think it's very fantastic that we have you here, because there's a lot of curiosity about AI, its disruptive effect, but also a lot of questions about technology as a whole. Last but not least, to my immediate right is a face I'm sure you'll recognize, Robert Fox, defense editor and commentator of the Evening Standard. He's been a journalist for 54 years, so I think we can call you one of the deans of the journalism community here in the United Kingdom. Like I said, currently defense and security editor, foreign commentator, reviewer at the Evening Standard. He's also been a broadcaster and writer for numerous outlets, including BBC and Sky, and also a collection of books as well. Thank you for being here, for taking the time. Now, let's turn immediately, if I can, to the year that's just passed. And I wanted to start with Ravi. If you can give us an idea of what you think stood out for you, at least in 2024. And if you want to also pick up on the last few hours, what might have raised your eyebrows, and they might have been raised a few times, from the Trump inauguration.
Right. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So, looking back on the last year, look, the big thing, what we write about at Dealbook is the intersection between business and policy. And I think the thing that really surprised me, the election, obviously, in the US was the big moment for the world, as we're seeing in the last few days. And I think the thing that surprised me most, really, was the speed with which business leaders in the States came over to Trump's side. The picture for me from the inauguration that really stood out, alongside Melania Trump's hat to avoid getting kissed by Donald Trump, it appeared, was the sight of the 3 richest men in the world standing next to each other on a dais watching the inauguration. Elon Musk, of course, we alluded to the South African earlier, Paul did, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg. And the reason, I guess, I was surprised at the U-turn was particularly for Zuckerberg and Bezos, who during the first term had come out quite public, Trump's first term, become quite publicly really in opposition to him and some of the things he stood for. I remember some of the statements from business leaders after the January 6th Capitol riots / protests, and they were pretty scathing about what this meant for American democracy and therefore, by extension, American business. So seeing that turnaround, that U-turn, and how far some of those CEOs have gone in trying to make up with Trump, And their expression of optimism under his presidency has been pretty stark to me. One reflection the last couple of days, like Michael, I'm a Canadian, and one exciting thing, unusually, is that the world's actually looking at Canada. Trump, as we know, has threatened tariffs on February 1st. And I think what that bigger question about Canada's role and the impact of Trump is, I've been thinking a lot about, really, is what we're seeing now with Trump and his allies, is that the blip, or is that the new norm? I think a lot of people thought that actually Trump was the blip when he first won power, and yet he's obviously come back much, much stronger. And I guess Canada is an example where he's brought down a government, essentially. The finance minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, former finance minister, whose resignation really prompted Trudeau to eventually call it quits, was scathing about his approach to Trump and saying the country really wasn't prepared. And I remember talking to a senior government official in Canada a few months ago, maybe kind of a year ago almost now. And his view, and Trudeau was already trailing massively in the opinion polls, there was a view within certain portions of the Canadian establishment that Trump's election would be an electoral asset for left liberal leaders such as Justin Trudeau. And I think what we've seen is it actually might be the exact opposite. And we're going to see a lot of big elections coming in Europe, obviously in Germany. France isn't that far off. What is Trump's election going to portend for all those big decisions and all the kind of ripple effects that means for people who run businesses, people who live in all the other countries that aren't actually in America or even allies of America? So that's what's on my mind.
And as a Canadian, I should add that we can't just give credit to Trump for the demise of Trudeau. Yeah, a lot of it was, in my view, self-imposed. Trudeau had among the most number of scandals, as I've written for CNN Opinion, of any other Canadian prime minister. And I think similar issues that you're facing here in the United Kingdom, cost of living crisis, among them decline of our health system, a lot of concerns about immigration also played into this, but thanks for that. Ben, things that stood out for you on 2024 and your hot take from the inauguration?
Yeah, I'll try and give you a couple of positives and maybe some things that you might not have been thinking about but is worth looking at. Obviously, as you said, last year was the year of elections, and in my patch of the world we had really big and important elections in Taiwan, in India, in Indonesia, Japan, across much of the rest of South Asia as well. And when we have these big debates about, and obviously partly connected to Trump and a broader discussion about, is democracy backsliding, is democracy in decline, is democracy dead? And I always think it's the wrong way to think about democracy. It almost envisages democracy as some sort of museum piece in glass, and it's either there and it's perfect and it's working, or it's broken. But democracy is always a fight for power between different interest groups, between different ideas, between different parts of society. So yes, and the two moments that stood out for me weren't any of the elections. There were two unexpected things, and think tanks, like everyone else, we're really bad at predictions, especially about the future. So actually, I'm going to say that it was Bangladesh and South Korea. And in Bangladesh, we saw Sheikh Hasina, who'd been in power for a long time, ousted in a kind of people power revolution. Now, what's followed, an interim government isn't necessarily going to be perfect. There's going to be issues, but you basically had a kleptocratic regime that had certain authoritarian tendencies that was deeply embedded, ousted by people going to the streets. And while it wasn't completely peaceful, there was violence that was contained. So I think that was, in many senses, a positive surprise. And the other one I would say is South Korea, where President Yoon Suk-yeol tried to very strangely impose martial law. I was in Seoul the week before, and there was no expectation that anything weird was about to happen. It was totally unexpected. And he was very quickly removed from office peacefully. Now he's on trial and likely to be impeached and convicted and removed, and there should be another election. So I think those are two examples where people saw things that they didn't like and used the mechanisms they had available to overturn unpleasant things. So it's just a reminder that people do have power, and democracy is always going to be a fight. So don't get too downhearted about things being in decline. Think about what you can do to make it better.
Just quickly on Bangladesh, under the new government, I'm wondering, Bangladesh has among the biggest, not the biggest refugee camps in the world of Rohingya refugees from Myanmar, formerly Burma. Are they expected to continue keeping the door open to them?
Well, I think the new government's obviously got, as an interim government, they've got huge issues. I think it's probably one of the last things on their mind. They've got so many other bigger problems. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that because there's a new government, and its chief advisor is Mohammed Yunus, who some people know because of his Grameen Bank and links to microfinance, that means everything's going to be easy. So dealing with the Rohingya refugee camps is probably quite low down on the list of very, very many issues they have to deal with.
Bianca, what stood out for you from last year and any takeaways from the Trump inauguration?
So I'll start with more of a personal reflection that I think has far wider ramifications. So as Michael said, I've been at CNN for 10 years as an anchor, and then I moved to a board role at the world's biggest industrial AI company. So not Meta size, about 20 billion valuation. So still big and making waves in the tech landscape. Now, I thought I knew a decent amount about AI and technology before I started working in it. And then I rapidly realized that I was profoundly wrong. But what has dawned on me is the deficit of information that legislators and politicians have. As to the media, I would have put myself in that category too, when it comes to technology. So how are we supposed to hold these people to account, to scrutinize what's going on, to set the guardrails and be part of the discussion, which is impacting all of our democracies and every citizen in the world, if that knowledge isn't there? So that was one of my biggest surprises, which now is something I work on directly in my role with government affairs and industry bodies and so on, which ties quite neatly into my reflection from the inauguration, which was seeing all of the tech bros and Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, etc., front and center, instead of senior members of his incoming cabinet. And the positive, if we want to extrapolate one, would be that clearly those are individuals that don't just understand this space, they are the ones defining it and creating it. So you have that knowledge base at the heart of government. But naturally, this also raises concerns, because if you think about the soft power concentration there, so it's natural, even in democracies we see oligarchic tendencies frequently, power, money, they move towards the center. But soft power is, the contours of that are defined by our social media platforms. So these are people that control information, control public sentiment to a large extent, as well as having the money that they do and the access that they do. So they're just things to think about very keenly this year, and obviously to keep an eye on. It's going to be a huge determinant of what the next 6 months look like.
Robert, what stood out for you?
It's a bit difficult because I'm at a lower level. I'm a general, by the way, and I've been a general since 1967. I'm a general reporter, and I am one of these ignorant slobs that Bianca has referred to. Let's go back, because I remember him well, to Sherlock Holmes. There's nothing so deceptive as the obvious fact. And I'm going to draw 4 points from 2024, which drives my thinking, and that means it's wrong. First of all, at the very beginning of the year, I learned about the year 2012, which I think is going to drive everything. That was the year of peak baby. We are now, in most of the developed world, entering the era of demographic autumning. In 3 publications I work for, we're banned from the expression demographic winter. But I think it's going to be dramatic as we go on, particularly in the second half of this century, the decline. I thought that this was going to come up with your mentioning of South Korea. When you look at the TFR, total fertility rate, 0.7 per married couple, child, and Italy, Japan, we can do that. Let's park that. This is a very, very big statistic, and disguised statistics, which we won't face up to, is very much part of my message. The other thing that I would like to look at is probably the most overused word in the socio-strategic lexicon, and it's resilience. We all talk about resilience, and we haven't a clue in practical terms what it really means. I will say, just listening to Dame Kate Bingham today, testifying to the COVID inquiry, that we're completely unprepared for a similar pandemic in the near future in the UK. I think we're unprepared for the implications of complex societal resilience, and defense. And I think that's a thing that you can firmly lay at the door of almost any developed government. And by the way, in Trump land, it's just as strong as it is in Starmer land. The other thing, if I sound gloomy, that's why I was saying, I think there is a sense of gloom, because I think, this is point 3, we are in the new age of anxiety. And I've been trying to explain to myself, actually, in the deep background, I'm a historian by trade, and I'm a medieval and early modern historian. So I'm a great devotee of the French school of Annales, of Marc Bloch, Fèvre, and above all, Fernand Braudel, who talk about the conception of history being either conjunctural, where events meet with social and other phenomena, and events, political social history, namely kings, battles, and so on, and then the longue durée, the long background, the big landscape, the seas, the skies, the changing conditions of atmospheres, explained brilliantly in Braudel's book, The Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II. The problem is the longue durée has become short. And the fact is that the background in history, climate, conditions like that, has come to the foreground. This is feeding the new age of anxiety. Ice melts, for example, the way the wrangling about the science of the fires in Los Angeles, the wrangling has become politicized. And so I will conclude with this, and this gives us our bookends. We have come absolutely with a juddering halt with what's going on across the world, and particularly in Trump land, is that the end of history era is over. In other words, in 1989, when the wall came down, there was an expression of optimism enhanced in 1992 by the Fukuyama book, The End of History and the Last Man, which wasn't about the end of history, but history was convergent. And Fukuyama has recanted from that, as we know, the idea that it was going to be the liberal economic system that would take over. I was in the room when James Baker III made his great speech in Berlin in 1989, a month after the wall came down, in which he was saying that the rules-based order was enhanced and would take over. The UN would be more important than the military alliances like NATO, without saying the word which came up in the lexicon within 6 weeks: the peace dividend was at hand. Take the occasion of the Aric Missile in November, wasn't it, when it was launched? Look at the 2 speeches recorded for television. One at an Astana conference, but one direct, very short address to television by Putin. What he was saying, the peace dividend era is really finished, because he was threatening unpredictable war on your doorstep, one, and ominously he was saying we must protect our allies, and talking about a deepening war in Asia, a potential even for the reignition of the Korean War. So that is where we are in the new age of anxiety now, and that's why we're getting such stridency, such vehemence in the expression of journalism. But, can I say, in my 80th year, I'm 80 this year, this is where I'm with Gramsci, and I always get it the wrong way around, you know, the pessimism of the intellect, the optimism of the soul. I am an optimist, by the way, and I don't think the word, I don't think what we're doing now, and I don't think journalism, and I don't think the news business is dead. It may well save us all. Thank you.
You're here to that. And just a footnote, the Aric Missile, which Robert referred to, Putin took great glee to brag about it. It's capable of curing a nuclear warhead, but of course the one that hit Dnipro didn't have one. But he was boasting that when it does explode, it creates temperatures that rival the temperature on the surface of the sun. It travels at several kilometers per second. And also he boasted of how it can turn concrete into dust and also destruct things several layers below the soil. So really scary stuff, and he's threatened to fire 3 of them at once at decision-making centers. Going back to tariffs, Ravi, as a Canadian, we're watching this very carefully. So in the past 24 hours, Trump, to just remind you, Trump has threatened 25% each on Mexico and Canada. The candidates for the Liberal Party, especially Chrystia Freeland, has said if this happens, we're going to retaliate like the US hasn't seen before, especially with oil. What kind of I don't get is, doesn't Trump realize that from his previous tariff exercises that it just raises the cost for a lot of products for folks back home? Appliances, even, God forbid, the price of gas goes up in the United States. That's a big political liability. And the other thing I'm wondering about is, what kind of advice do you think he's going to be getting? Because a lot of the so-called grown-ups in the room from the last administration aren't there anymore. We expected, for example, his former Secretary of State to be in the inner circle this year. Nikki Haley isn't going to be part of it.
Nor Pompeo.
Yeah, any thoughts on that?
Right. We should preface this by saying none of us know what Trump's thinking. And his advisors have some influence, but he's obviously clearly his own man and makes his own decisions as he chooses to. On tariffs with Canada, and this is the last time we should mention that we're both Canadian, but Canadians do that a lot, as you all know. And we'll list every famous Canadian you think is American with regularity. Look, I mean, the Canadian and American economies are deeply integrated. There's something like, if you think about a car that's manufactured in North America, it tends to go across the border about 7 times before it's finished. Similarly, if we extend to Mexico, there's a lot of integration with the economy and manufacturing processes. Last time, Chrystia helped renegotiate the NAFTA agreement and create a new trade deal with the Americans in Mexico. Yes, she says that they're going to impose tariffs like America's never seen before, which sounds very Trumpian. The reality is Canada relies on America and America relies on Canada. So I suspect at some point they might get a deal done, but inevitably he likes to generate a lot of attention. He is perfect for the social media age, and there's going to be a lot of noise, and I don't think it's because he doesn't want to. He's obviously looking for a better deal. Maybe he wants Canada to increase the amount it spends on defense, along with NATO members. In terms of what advice he's getting, I don't know. He's got a lot of people around. I mean, one big question for me is how long does the bromance between him and Elon Musk last? Because they're both guys who like attention. So will they carry on?
Do you think, for example, if NAFTA is torn up, you might see bilateral agreements between Canada and Mexico directly as a result of this?
Well, there was, as you know, a former Canadian Prime Minister had said that Canada should be much tougher and develop alliances with other countries that are also under attack by Trump's America. I mean, possibly, but I mean, ultimately, America is the biggest economy in the world, and a country like Canada can't easily switch off its relationship with the U.S. So probably at some point there'll be some sort of renegotiation and some kind of new deal that emerges, but I find it hard to believe they'll turn on America even if they try to create kind of trade arrangements with other countries. I mean, one telling example of this is I interviewed Stephen Harper, a former Canadian Prime Minister, a few years ago when I worked at the FT, and he made a point that energy reliance on the U.S. was too strong and Canada needed to really turn its attention to Asia, and particularly China. And as we all know, relations with China have really gone south. So it's not so easy to replace America. And frankly, economically, you don't want to replace America. You want to be part of that market. So there's going to be something. But what it is, I don't know.
As Canadians, we just can't understand why Trump is so mean to us. I mean, we send so many snowbirds there every winter to Florida, don't we, who bought property and spend money? But we'll leave that for another time. Speaking of threats, Ben, and US-China relations, I wanted to get into that a little bit. I was bored one night and I was watching just recently Defense Secretary nominee Peter Hegseth testify, and he said the new administration would have the CCP in its crosshairs. I think those are his exact words. And just a few hours ago, Trump said, while he was signing all these executive orders, that more terrorists are coming China's way on the world's second biggest economy. How do you see US-Sino relations evolving over the next 4 years under Trump? And of course, the big elephant of the room is, of course, Taiwan. I'm going to go to Robert a little bit later about hemispheric ambitions, but whether this is something that Trump will leave alone and concentrate on other things.
Well, I think it is interesting that, I mean, Ravi and I were talking about it earlier, but certainly in the first term, Trump did oversee this shift in US policy towards China that was probably long overdue. And there were people, in the US system who were already saying that they needed to have a tougher stance. So I think that was already potentially in the works, but somehow, the timing worked out. But I'm not sure what Trump himself really thinks about China or how much he cares about it. He's talked about the tariffs a lot in the past, but I don't think he's interested in the competition for ideas or political systems or influence in the global south with China in the way that, say, some of the key people in the US Congress or State Department or Pentagon are. And Trump generally, his track record, both in office and beforehand, was that he likes trade wars and talking about them. He doesn't really like real war. So in some senses, I think Trump will be wary of anything that would lead to a military escalation with China. But obviously, he wants to kind of rally support against China. He wants to use the threat of China in some way to get things through at home in terms of the industrial strategy, if you can call it a strategy that he wants, in terms of getting investment and jobs. But it's not clear if that means sort of less China or more China, right? If you look at what he said about TikTok, maybe the play is to say threaten China with tariffs and bring in more Chinese investment, because that could be the answer. It's also, I think, a question of the people around him. And if you look at the mix, it's actually much more diverse in Trump 2.0 compared to the first time. The first time it was more kind of traditional Republicans with a bit of crazy sort of right, but now you have these kind of business figures, the more mercurial ones like Musk, but quite a lot of conventional Wall Street, hedge fund, private equity people who all have a kind of innate interest in more business, more trade flows, more investment flows with China. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how things come out in the wash. I think in Beijing, they're nervous. Their own economy has not been doing well. They've been struggling to recover really since COVID, so they're not in a strong position there. I think on the upside, they see the transactional nature of Trump, that he's someone they can maybe do a deal with. On the other side, could they trust that a deal with Trump would hold? Probably not. And I think they do worry about sort of what they would view as their red lines on things like Taiwan, and Trump having the potential to tweet or say things that could be very destabilizing for them. So I think they'll be wary. The last thing I think, which is sort of a good thing from Beijing's perspective, is sort of the erosion of faith in the kind of US-led system that having Trump back a second time kind of brings with it, and the pressure it will put on the alliance system, both Trump's allies in North America, like Canada, its allies in Europe, and also critically in Asia. So I think that's a positive for China to have these tensions in the alliance system as they look to their future, where maybe China can displace the US in some ways. I think that's a positive, but it's going to be a nervous time for the next 4 years.
Can I just jump in? Actually, one other thing I was going to add to that, Ben, is I think Musk's presence at the heart of power is potentially something that might be quite advantageous to China. I mean, Tesla's biggest factory in the world is in Shanghai. It still has a big business in China. Having said that, I think, Musk is quite mercurial. So perhaps they feel they have a bit of leverage by having the buddy in chief next to Trump and able to influence, because his business relies so heavily on the country. So there's kind of different relationships now, aren't there, than Trump won, and I think he would be one example of those.
And just before I go to Bianca about technology and resources, Ben, sidebar question. Do you think that Xi Jinping has been watching Putin closely in terms of the war in Ukraine, and that so many red lines have been crossed that that's going to be part of his calculations in terms of timing of Taiwan? And when it comes to Trump, how lovely it must be to have no ideological baggage, that sure, let them take over Taiwan, it's not a big deal. Perhaps Trump thinking that way. Again, no one knows what's going on in his head, but what do you think?
Well, there's a lot of talk about the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese leadership having some sort of timeline for retaking Taiwan, which is an independently governed country. Effectively, most countries in the world, including the UK, don't have bilateral diplomatic relations, but effectively Taiwan is its own independent de facto country. But I don't think they actually have a timeline. I think they have a goal to take Taiwan, to integrate Taiwan. I think they'd like to do that without an invasion if they can help it, but I don't think there's any specific timeline. I think Xi Jinping's got a lot of problems at home right now, so I don't think it's something that's imminently on the agenda if they feel they can avoid it and they don't feel they're provoked into it. So I don't really think that there is a timeline. Of course, I think that the Chinese military will be looking at what's happened in Ukraine. It's very different. I mean, the territory is very different. Taiwan is an island. It's mountainous. The legal situation is very different. I mean, Ukraine is a sovereign country, accepted by almost all of the world. I think Taiwan has, at the last count, 11 countries that accept it is an independent country. So if Taiwan were to be attacked or invaded, even for the US, it wouldn't be a question of sovereignty, because the US doesn't say that Taiwan has any sovereignty and is an independent nation. So I think they'll be looking at some of the lessons. I think the other interesting part of it is China's stance on Ukraine, which is sort of a pro-Russian neutrality, I think, as best described. Yeah, it has been sort of traded, I think, potentially for more support diplomatically from Russia for China's position on Taiwan. So we've seen the Kremlin sort of more explicitly rowing in behind China's claims to Taiwan. That's interesting, but I think we have to remember, in most of the rest of the world, most countries, most of the developing world, most of the global south, they just don't care about what's happening in Ukraine, and they don't really care about the Taiwan situation either. So I think we can get carried away in linking these things and thinking there's this sort of Chinese-Russian plot. Whether or not there is, most of the world doesn't see it in that way.
Okay, Bianca, I wanted you to talk a little bit about the good side of tech, but while we're on this topic and geopolitics and strongmen, do you think that a lot of their behavior, a lot of their territorial ambitions will be tied to precious and rare minerals, exactly the stuff that tech needs to operate?
Certainly, because what can you do without them? So rare earth elements are integral to the production of any form of advanced technology, essential for defense, essential for all of these consumer electronics that people have. The world would literally grind to a halt as we know it if we didn't have them. Now, if I remember correctly, China processes around 85% of those rare earth elements and has about 60% of the global reserves. In terms of other countries, Brazil is number 2. So Brazil has about half the amount that China does. Russia is also one of the largest sources of untapped reserves. Now, the US has a meager amount in comparison. So we hear far-flung ideas like asteroid mining or recycling of existing technology product, etc., but they are going to be in trouble. Now, I don't know if we have any prizes, but can anyone guess another country that we've heard Trump talk about lately that is very rich in these rare... Yes, Greenland. So it is an essential part of the geopolitical calculus, and this is one of the elements of the strategic rivalry which is so pronounced between China and the US. And China has stated very clearly that it intends to be the world leader in AI in 2030, which means that it needs those reserves. But equally, something which might act as a bit of a buffer or a potential backstop, if you like, to trade tensions is China relies heavily on the US's advanced production. So it might have the raw materials, but it needs the US's lithography and advanced production elements on the end. The US desperately needs China's raw materials. So they know that they require each other, and that may well be beneficial, certainly in the near term.
Yeah, and it's not only Greenland. I was jet-lagged watching Trump this morning in the early hours, and he was talking about Gaza and its seafront property, how it'd be great for these seaside condos. Of course, probably with his name on it. And then we talked, Bianca, about the tech bros, and I think there's a lot of concern about the growing influence of the tech bros. In fact, President Biden in his last speech warned us about the tech brothers oligarchy, about the ultra-wealthy tech industrial complex. But having said that, someone mentioned COVID pandemic, and it was exactly technology that kept us connected, that kept us, kids educated, that allowed us to keep communicating with our loved ones who might have been locked away. It helped us do a lot of things. But we also have AI, which is scaring a lot of people. And I think when you and I talked, we talked about the need for politicians and others to up their tech literacy. But how do we do that?
Well, first of all, I should state where I stand on this. So in technology, typically, we divide between the doomsters and then the EACs, or effective accelerationists, who are more like Musk and believe that AI is going to be able to solve our most difficult global problems faster, whether that is issues in healthcare or climate change and so on. So, and there's obviously valid arguments on both sides. Now, in terms of the pandemic, I was actually with a company quite recently that are using artificial intelligence mechanisms to find genomic sequences in the air, in public places, in airports, and they will be able to report that to local government. That requires cross-border cooperation if that was going to be any form of effective response to a pandemic. But naturally, technologies can be a huge boon in these situations. However, many lifetimes ago, I was a nonverbal communication analyst, and naturally body language is an important part of how we communicate, and it changes our neural pathways, and it's important for child development, for human happiness, for learning. And technology takes us further away from that at times too. I do think social media is quite a misnomer when we actually look at what's happening inside people's brains neurologically when they engage with technology. So there are many benefits, but I think it's inherently Janus-faced, like any technology. It's just that it's moving so much faster and that it's so much more powerful. So the benefits and the drawbacks are equally profound, and it reflects human behavior. These things are, after all, modeled on the human brain, like the earliest parts of machine learning to what we see today. And even agentic AI, which is a big trend for 2025, that's modeled on human social structures in the way that they work together. So it will likely reflect us and our traits, our positive aspects and our more dark, nefarious ones.
Can I ask a question in relation
Absolutely.
to that? Absolutely. Sorry. Oh, microphone. Sorry. Apologies. Can I ask a question to you and to the panel? You're talking about the education of politicians in this. Do we now have an issue with the problem of the machinery of parties, of political parties, that really there is such a disincentive in the way party structures, particularly in Western Europe, go, to really learn this? Your apprenticeship is at something else, and not this kind of continuous life education that you are describing that is needed. Can I reflect? There's a very interesting article in the New York Times today about what kind of monarchical presidency Trump is going to have. And it looks back to the founding fathers. I'm sorry to go back to history, but it's very interesting, the spat between Jefferson and Adams, particularly about whether this would be a monarchy at all. But it is pointed out that when the Constitution was devised by the founding fathers in the state, parties didn't exist. Parties existed more in the home country that they'd rebelled against, the Whigs and the Tories. And I think that this is going to be a very questionable condition of our politics here. It's, I think that I was saying in the green room before that what one is looking for is that somebody would do an Alexis de Tocqueville of the mid to late 21st century. What democracy, or rather polity, in America is going to look at. And one of the things that Tocqueville addresses is the role of the party. And I think that this is depressing a lot of the information exchange at the level that you're describing. For instance, if you look at this country, is that public education is so politically biased one way or another, whereas we should be looking against the binary system. Arts, sciences, it's ridiculous. We should be much closer to a baccalaureate system if we're going to embrace the world that Bianca has talked about. So that I throw on the table, and I think it's one of the conclusions that I see bubbling up from the discussion already. What kind of community, what kind of politics will be the basis of community activity in the next quarter of the 21st century? Thank you.
When we project forward as well, even though I've made this point about the criticality of people understanding the technology, it's also about knowing the right questions to ask and the ethical frameworks to put onto it, because it reminds me in many ways, technology, of breaking news, my previous career, because things are moving so quickly and there's more information than you can possibly comprehend as a human being. So what becomes important then? It's knowing where to look for the red flags, it's asking the right questions and understanding the ethical framework to apply. And that's where I believe that our politicians and elected representatives need to refine their skills the most. I do also think that artificial intelligence could be used to make democracy more robust in a way that would be simple for politicians to use. Like actually in Taiwan, they use it at the moment, I think, to crowdsource public opinion on key topics and policies. South Korea has also used it. I think Estonia too. So there's hints of it happening. And essentially you could understand what a population is thinking about an issue. You can analyze feedback very rapidly, and also, and this is key, run really high fidelity simulations of policies. So policy outcomes, instead of you and I arguing for opposite policy, saying, well, I think it will do this, and you say, well, it will do this, well, then we'll have a model which will demonstrate the impact of the policy on economics, society, etc. So things like that wouldn't even require too much knowledge of politicians themselves. But I think other than a practical, technical understanding, it needs to be the ethical frameworks and, frankly, the existential questions.
I mean, I think on this point, it's easy to look for some sort of all-encompassing cause of problems, right? It's about the political parties and no one wants to be members, or it's that terrible people now want to be politicians, or it's about social media algorithms. But kind of a much more, I think, realistic view, and kind of depressing but uplifting at the same time, is it's actually about all of us, right? And I think the best politicians in the world succeed by reflecting back to people things that they want to hear, whether that's Xi Jinping in an authoritarian one-party state where there's no elections, but you still need some kind of implied consent from the people, or whether it's Trump, or whether it's Starmer, or whoever. That's how they succeed. They reflect back what we want to hear. So instead of saying, well, why do we get such terrible people? How do we get rid of them? You know, I think it's us, right? These people are reflecting fears that we have. I mean, you talked about anxiety. They're reflecting concerns that we have. And I think there is also a problem of like good people stepping out of politics and not wanting to go in. But the answer to that isn't to vote for another crap politician. It's for people to get more engaged by the society. But I'd be skeptical about technology being some sort of panacea there, because again, if people's knowledge of it and trust in it is low, while some of the tools might help, again, I don't think technology is kind of value neutral in that sense. It's how you use it. But really it needs people to want to be engaged.
Can I just
there's
defend
also-
myself for just saying that I was not saying that. I don't think it's going to disappear or you should do that overnight. And we
Neither
are
do I.
looking at an evolutionary process which you're both describing. Sorry to interrupt you.
I think we're all right. Okay. Look, the truth is, I don't think you're necessarily wrong, but ultimately the post-World War institutional consensus is kind of breaking down, and I think the U.S. is a kind of interesting example, partly because it's the most powerful country in the world, where you don't have a kind of a shared space where discussion happens all the time. And what you're seeing, you think about the world that we live in, media, it's such a bifurcated, extreme space. In a different way to the UK, where the BBC, even if you hate the BBC, you at least know where it is in the kind of national conversation. In parts of the US, you have a completely split system where a certain group of Democrats might consume a certain type of media, and a certain group of Republicans might completely ignore all of that and listen to 3-hour podcasts or get their information in very different ways. So I just think there's a kind of this idea that, as Ben says, it's not one thing that's kind of leading to it, but there are, when I was a university student, these are the kind of things we kind of were hoping for. The whole system would kind of be under scrutiny and question, and now it is, and now that I'm old, it's like, oh shit. So I think everything's up for grabs a little bit, and the kind of power of technology is kind of supercharging that, and that conversation, and the pace of change is so extraordinary that it's a struggle to kind of keep up. And Trump, for all of his faults, I'm glad Ben made this point. He's been an extremely successful politician, and he's done, don't forget, when he was first running again for the Republican nomination this time, everyone was against him. Everyone was against him, knowing what he did last time. And now people, the inauguration was in the rotunda where they had the January 6th riot/protest. It's an extraordinary turn of events in just a few years. So he has tapped into something, whether we want to like it or not, and that's been turbocharged in a way that I think is of a profoundly different level than it was in the first term.
And
Mike,
go ahead.
Sorry, can I just make a final point on the caliber of politician, and where I do think technology is having a detrimental impact on that. So when I was about 16 or 17, I started working in politics, doing a lot of campaigning. And back then, it was never great fun. You'd get spat at occasionally. More people than you'd expect answer the door with no clothes on, which is also something to be wary of. UK. Shocking, because it was cold as well. Anyway, and so you would have negativity, and a lot of it. But as social media really took off, it took on a life of its own, and it became really vitriolic and deeply personal, and you couldn't escape it. And then you saw doxing, when you publicly publish somebody's address and encourage people on social media to go and find them and attack them. And what I noticed when I was at CNN interviewing politicians, good ones, who were stepping down at elections, they said, look, I'm going to work in the third sector. I'm going to try and make a difference. I'm going to be a headmistress of a local school because I can't in good faith subject my family to this. I don't feel secure. You know, MPs in this country don't have the security of elected representatives in the United States, for example. So I do think, I agree with you absolutely that citizens are responsible for the outcome of the people that we elect. However, I do think technology has exacerbated the negativity and disincentivized decent people from going into politics when there are other options available to them, because it just makes them too vulnerable. It's extraordinarily toxic. And why would they do that when they can do something else, make more money, and they feel like they can have more direct impact?
And I'm glad you mentioned the potential role of AI taking some pressure off the shoulders of politicians. In a shameless plug for my book, Digital Pandemic, down the back, I said, if the COVID-19 pandemic response were an exam, many world leaders would have to cheat on their finals to obtain a passing grade. Robert, we will talk about the rules-based international order in a moment and what's happening to it, but going back to the Trump speech, there are a few things that were glaringly absent. One of them was unity. Another one, of course, was taxes, raising taxes. No word of tackling the debt. But the things that stood out, no mention of China, just a passing reference when he talked about the Panama Canal, and nothing about Ukraine. And then when I watched him with the reporters this morning signing those executive orders, he was really trying to deflect all of the questions thrown at him about Ukraine and also about China, which makes me wonder, and I am kind of borrowing this theory from the FT, but could it be, this is for you, that Trump is thinking hemispherically, that I'm going to concentrate on North America, maybe more integration with Canada and Mexico, whether they like it or not, Greenland. Let Putin play in his playground in Russia and beyond, go up as far as he can to the EU borders perhaps, and the same thing with Xi Jinping. Let Taiwan, China sort themselves out. The far North Arctic, I think, is going to be a very contentious one. But we said it's very difficult to get into Trump's head, but might he be thinking just about hemispherically, concentrating everything on the North American continent?
I think you're onto something here. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, I think you're onto something here. I was struck how mercantilist, almost in an 18th century way, chunks of blocks of trade and, in inverted commas, interest. And why Ukraine has gone off the boil, I think, is that even in his hour of triumph, he has been bruised by the Gaza settlement, because probably he is being told by his team of envoys, because it's not only Huckabee, but Rubio and the others, his NSA must be telling him, actually, this is barely going to last into the middle of next week, the way things are looking. And the great king of the transactions, it's not going to work, and he knows that there isn't a quick fix transaction available for Ukraine. And one of the things I think we're being a bit too smart about, Trump, is that these big gestures, these slogans almost, and it is a very different Trump of this inaugural from the one that we had the time before in 2017, but it still ain't no Lincoln's second inaugural. It's not a well thought out piece. And I think things like, and I hope we come to it later, and I'm going to park it for the moment, one of the most striking things was cancelling the WHO, even more shocking than the Paris Climate Agreement. Had he really thought out the implications of this? It strikes me, read China, he hadn't. And so we come back to this chunk of territory. But let's look at Panama Canal, and Greenland. And even, you know, it's like a plan of battle. It doesn't survive the first 5 minutes of contact. That the Greenland proposition that you're going to bully, buy, or even invade to cow Denmark into doing this, I mean, it's unthinkable that they would have a military expedition to do this. I mean, we know why he sees it, but it's not even chess. It's almost a game of drafts that he is playing here. And one of the things that I would point out, we haven't brought out although expenditure is enormous, 839 billion on defense, even the US defense picture is much more hollowed out than people realize. And I finish answering your question here. Yes, he is going to be regional because he can't do the lot. And this is what he is telling European NATO. We can't do Europe, we can't do the Middle East, where we'll do a bit, and we can't do the South China Sea and the South Pacific, because we just don't have, in conventional terms, the resources for all that.
Could I just
Please,
jump
go
in?
ahead, yeah.
Yeah,
So I think
sorry.
there's a longer term question here, and I actually like to see almost a straight line trajectory from Obama through Trump through Biden to Trump again, of sort of America turning inwards, which also tallies with America peaking as a global superpower in terms of its economic power, its military power, in relative terms. I mean, America will probably still be the world's biggest economy, depending on how you measure it for a long time, maybe forever, still have probably the world's biggest military in many sense, but its rivals, including obviously chiefly China, but also other big emerging economies, India and others in Asia. So the relative balance of power is shifting structurally, and we know that all great powers and great empires, mature and fall eventually. So there's a structural shift, but also I think there's a cyclical shift back to a more kind of isolationist turn in the US, which throughout US modern history, we know that the US has gone through these cycles. So I think the combination of the structural peaking of relative US power with the cyclical turn inwards, I think that's been happening over the last 10 or 15 years. It's not just Trump. And I think that's the sort of thing that might see us in the next 10, 20, 30 years move to this kind of spheres of influence world, potentially, where Russia can sort of dominate, parts of Eastern Europe and Eurasia, China, Asia, and the US will sort of secure its own backyard. So I think that is a fear that, lots of powers, including US allies, have in Asia. It's what the Japanese are thinking about in the medium term. It's what the Koreans are thinking about. Do they need to kind of look after their own security? Do they need to build their own nuclear weapons over time? So I think, in a sense, that would be quite normal. That's what you would expect if you would look back in history. We'll have to see what happens.
Yeah, it's worth remembering. I mean, Biden's disastrous pullout of Afghanistan was seen as a kind of pivotal moment in terms of how Putin thought about whether the U.S. would intervene. And I think you're right. That's the structural shift, is that isolationist turn in the U.S. And actually, are these conflicts we don't need to really get involved in because they don't matter to us. And I think that's a big shift. Obviously, in the past, the message was it's in the U.S. interest to have peace in the world elsewhere in other parts of the world, and now it's take care of ourselves first, right?
Quickly, can I just suggest, as a provocation, that I think it's going to be easier for the US to disengage in Eastern Europe than it is in the Middle East. And I think that's going to be the real difficulty for him, because there is no elegant solution, there's no elegant proof for the Middle East. You can say, yeah, let's jack up the Abraham Accords, let's get Saudi Arabia involved, but that's where we are getting black swans. We're getting, nobody really saw the outcome, the sudden collapse of Assad, which probably means qualitatively rather than quantitatively more commitment of the US. And the sort of element, the medium element that we're not factoring, not taken part in our discussion so far, is a figure like Recep Tayyip Erdogan and neo-Ottomanism and what that is going to do and where it's going. And I think that's going to be far more significant, curiously, than whatever happens to Iran, because the prognosis for Iran immediately is not shaping good.
Mm-hmm. And we should note that we're also seeing Gulf states, we're seeing Saudi, Qatar, UAE playing a bigger role. They played a very, very big role in the Gaza settlement, but also in the Ukraine conflict, coordinating prisoner swaps. Saudi Arabia wants to host the next peace summit, so very interesting. We're going to go to audience questions in a sec, but I wanted to put Ravi on the spot on a question I didn't tell him.
Canada related?
No.
No more Canada, please.
Thank goodness.
So in Ukraine, we know a thing or two about the resilience of supply chains, having to transfer stuff from the sea to the road to rail and back again. I'm wondering about what's happening in the Red Sea, and also talk about the Panama Canal. Houthi rebels have disrupted shipping, apparently, reportedly, with targeting information provided by the Russians. Very interesting. And also, we could see constriction of trade in Panama Canal. What are we to make of this as global consumers? Are our supply chains that fragile, that kind of vulnerable to disruption, that it could make life quite difficult? for us?
Yeah, there's always kind of a risk, and as you said, the Houthis in Yemen have targeted ships going through the Mediterranean and elsewhere in the Gulf. I think short term, obviously, there are potential issues around supply chain resilience, and kind of we saw that in the pandemic, what happened with that. I think the two things I would throw into the mix. I think it's worth remembering that for all of the trade war stuff that happened between the US and China under Trump 1, and indeed under Biden, trade between the US and China is actually still going gangbusters. I mean, people in the US are still buying lots of Chinese stuff. The second thing I would throw in, and I think this is maybe a little bit of a provocation and worth remembering, and Ben might have a view on this as well, is for all the restrictions and sanctions that the US and the West have been putting on China, China is also, at least as an exporter, been pretty clever and resilient. I mean, we must remember that its manufacturing prowess is extraordinary. What it's achieved in decades and built to make our iPhones or to make toys or whatever else might be is incredible and very hard to replicate. A country like India have tried. Two things have happened. One is a lot of those supply chain experts have gone in other parts of Asia, like Vietnam, in order to supply the US without kind of having to deal with those same restrictions. The country that I thought was most interesting, that was Mexico. If you were to go to Mexico 12, 15 years ago and compare it to now, and talk to anyone who's involved in supply chain, you see a lot more Chinese there, because what they're doing is they're doing the final assembly of cars and other products in Mexico and shipping into the US to get around those restrictions. So while obviously all these trade issues and trade wars are going to be problematic and for business add a whole layer of uncertainty, the capacity of Chinese companies to get around some of those is extraordinary. The last thing I'll end on is just take a look at the last few weeks as kind of TikTok has supposedly been about to go dark. The most downloaded app in the US was another Chinese social media app. Similarly, yeah, exactly. Temu, T-E-M-U, is for 2 years running the most downloaded Apple app in the US. It set itself up to pretend to look like an American company. In fact, it's a Chinese e-commerce platform. So extraordinary resilience and inventiveness, and somehow the capacity for Western consumers to buy cheap Chinese stuff will resist any kind of supply chain issues.
Yeah, just to jump in there, this comes back to a question for citizens or voters or humans is the trade-off. Right? So resilience comes at a cost. Yeah. So what is the cost you want to pay for your iPhone to not be reliant on Chinese components? Because the number of high-value components, basically an iPhone is made in China, the IP is from America, but everything is there. And things like the screens and everything else are highly complex products, the manufacturing of which has been honed by private sector companies, not by the Chinese Communist Party in China over decades and decades. And that just can't be replicated. China has roughly a third of world sort of manufacturing capacity, and there's no way that can be broken up. And in as much as sort of the Biden administration's push, its rhetoric and the measures it's taken has done so, you've just seen Chinese manufacturing and supply chain shift to Vietnam or to Hungary or to Romania or to Mexico. So then you have to say, is the sort of Chinese risk element actually any lower? Probably not. It's just shifted around. But the result is that we get cheap, really high quality goods. And so what price are we willing to pay? The other problem is just the complexity of everything we use. And for each manufacturer along the supply chain, it's not very profitable. I used to cover manufacturing for the FT in China, so I spent a lot of time on the factory floor. The profit margins are really, really, really small. So if you want to take the hundreds of processes needed to make the average kind of electronic good and bring them into Europe or bring them into the US, you'll be spending a lot of money on really toxic processes to make tiny metal or plastic components. And that's just not something I think our governments and our citizens are willing to do.
Interestingly, the company that I work for now, we work specifically on this AI solution called, sounds extremely boring, so brace yourselves, planning, scheduling, optimization, which is used, I mean, seriously, you can tell that they're not media people, right? But what it does is, for example, in a manufacturing situation, it will cut down every unnecessary mile. It will reduce emissions for some companies by half per annum because it finds the most efficient way of doing things. But interestingly, it's being applied to really hot geopolitical zones as well, because of course, supply chain disruption always has been, it's a bi-directional threat because if you've got a volatile geopolitical situation and there's an attack and it hits a supply chain, that's heightened geopolitical tensions because that's been an attack on the country whose supply chain it belonged to. And these things can spiral. So being able to avoid situations like that is really important. So artificial intelligence can, for example, aggregate real-time data, weather patterns, geopolitical bulletins that are coming from relative foreign offices, news, any form of motion sensor, etc., aggregate them and in real time reroute ships in the Red Sea, change the schedule for whether it's vans or autonomous drones in conflict zones in Eastern Europe as well. All of that is being done, and I definitely don't think it's perfect. It's going to improve a lot in the next couple of years, but that's probably an area where it has averted numerous issues which we'll never know, but it's definitely becoming inseparable from geopolitics in a sense.
Thank you. We're going to go to audience questions, and then I'll circle back for our last one to the panel. If you're a journalist, politician, spy, or diplomat, please identify yourself, otherwise you can be anonymous. I think I'm there.
Hi. Thank you so much. It's a lot to unpack. But I just want to have one question. You mentioned briefly the move away from the Paris Agreement and along with, turn around on wind and the use of substitutes to EVs and the horrible war crime, drill, baby, drill. What do you think this intention or this statement around climate, what effect will that have on efforts and activities in the rest of the world?
Okay. Sure. Yeah. Let's take one more. Okay.
This is a direction maybe towards Ben and Bianca. Ben, you said that China doesn't have a timeline in terms of Taiwan, but by the time Trump leaves the White House in 4 years, it will be the 80th anniversary of the People's Republic. Would that be a date that China might be looking at, possibly? And also, the other thing was about, the other thing you made towards Bianca is, so TikTok has been given 75 days to comply with the law in the States to avoid going dark. If that doesn't happen, is Elon Musk looking to do a deal somehow with ByteDance?
Do you want to take that first, Bianca?
Do I? Well, unfortunately, just like we don't have direct oversight of Trump's thoughts, I also don't know what Musk is thinking. And even if I did right now, I'm not sure if it would be the same as what he's thinking in 75 days' time. My truthful answer is I don't know. What I suspect right now is that they will come to some form of deal. I think it's in the political interest as well. And there's a lot of pressure from people that are in Trump's inner circle who use TikTok to great success. It's hugely profitable, and it's also a really useful political instrument for the Republican Party. So I would suspect that they will come to a deal. And in the meantime, I will try and strike up a relationship with Elon Musk so I can give you a more direct answer in future.
And I remind you that Trump said that if he has allowed TikTok to come back, that the United States government, the people of America, will own, I think, half of it. So there's that other word again, transaction.
On Taiwan, one of the main objectives for China's People Liberation Army is to be able to take Taiwan one day. They obviously train with these mock-ups of the presidential palace in Taipei and other stuff like that. But again, I just don't think they'll launch a military invasion because of a deadline. And I think their preference is to get to Taiwan through other means, other kinds of coercion that don't require military force if necessary. But I think you're much more likely to see a military conflict because of some sort of spiral of escalation than an arbitrary deadline, I'd say. And just on the climate question as well, just from my perspective, I think in the short term, it's probably going to be really good for the US economy, right? It's going to boom in some senses, cheap energy and everything else. I think the other thing that I think about is, in the long term, it probably starts to put the US out of the game of developing the kind of green technologies that we need for the future, and that probably gives a net advantage to China, where we know a lot of solar cells, wind power, other things are being developed. But I think it's kind of the zeitgeist, right, across democracies, that green stuff sounded good when our economies were booming and the price of everything was cheap. But now we have supply chain issues and war and inflation, I think, in the UK too, and lots of other democracies. Voters are thinking, man, maybe we can wait on those net zero targets because we got more pressing problems. I'm not saying that's what I think, but that kind of is the zeitgeist.
And if I could just interject, AI, I believe, is expected to consume 18% of US electricity demand over the next 4 to 5 years. So there's a huge incentive to have the renewable energy development continue, because the carbon emissions from these massive data processing and AI farms are just, I think, beyond what people currently anticipate. And unless we make huge advancements in computing efficiency, that will continue for at least 5 years.
Two observations to make about the timeline for Taiwan. I absolutely agree with the rest of the panel. The one thing, and the great thing was because it was a target that was laid down in one of the documents of the PLA or the CCP that 2027 was going to be the year. That is off, because curiously, one of the things that they have learned from Ukraine is that in present terms of hard metal warfare, an amphibious operation across 100 kilometers of sea is going to be very, very difficult indeed. And this is where the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, has a problem. It has not fought a major campaign in a generation. The last time it fought in India, in the high area, things went very badly. They're going to be very reluctant to do that. And they have learnt, rather shockingly, the ability of innovation of the Ukrainian forces. That's one thing. The way that now Ukraine is generating more medium to low-level, low-grade drones than the rest of European NATO, certainly well above that, all put together. It has given them a pause for thought, but it's not showing that China is uncommitted, because there's a hell of a lot of dual-use stuff from China going through to the Russian military.
God forbid the Chinese take the North Korean example and send soldiers to Ukraine so they get real-world experience fighting. Let's do a couple more. Yep. Lady at the front here.
Thank you. I think I want to push back a bit on the idea that we can ask AI to give us the policy outcome, because I think, coming from like a political science perspective, I'd be quite scared of what kind of data we feed into the AI, and the idea that the outcome is just going to be the truth, and that it just, if we would do that, it would be that outcome. So basically my question is, how, if that's the way to go, how would you make sure that social factors and values are included in the data that we feed into the AI?
Okay, and take one more. I think you have one, yeah.
Thank you. Just echo what you said earlier on. Fascinating panel. I heard from a Japanese client recently that they're really quite concerned about not just the potential of conflict around Taiwan, but the colonisation of the South China Sea, particularly because of the constraints on the imports of energy. So one of the projects I'm working on at the moment is actually renewable energy source going into Japan, and we sell out of Canada, so the North Pacific route would be a particularly attractive aspect. Now, obviously, from the point of view of pushing that even further, I also heard today from some Malaysians that I was talking to that there is this concern, and it was the single biggest concern that they had following your inauguration speech yesterday. It wasn't at all bothered about, Canada, Greenland. It was what is going to be happening, what's going to encourage the Chinese in the South China Sea. So, Ben in particular, given your experience, I'd appreciate it.
Bianca, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yes, first of all, I agree with your concerns, and I apologise to anyone if I gave the impression that I actually thought this was a panacea and we should sort of dispense with the humans and just get the AI to make all of the decisions. I suppose if we're looking at the positives for how it could make democracy more robust, having that level of granularity, like, you know, if I wanted to know what you all thought of this panel tonight, I could just ask you now and you could put your hands up, or I could ask each of you to do a detailed survey, which is anonymous by yourselves, and then aggregate that data, and that is going to give me a better idea. So I think it will empower people with superior information to make decisions. And if we take the UK as an example, so population has increased, obviously, since British democracy fully flourished when we had the universal franchise. And we have MPs who are expected to be in Westminster scrutinising legislation and forming policy, and also dealing with their constituency issues, which is just frankly too much to get a particularly good service on either. So I think data and simulation can be helpful, but I 100% think it's in everyone's interest to have the human in the loop and to have the discussions based on human experiences, social feedback, rather than the data itself. But I do think that as the pressures increase, as the speed of change increases, and if we don't have enough people to do the correct jobs, then we need some support and help. And I think that artificial intelligence and data can be that. That's my hope. But I do share your concern.
Can I ask one question on that? Because we spoke earlier about the dearth of knowledge and understanding among politicians and policymakers and everyone else.
Not all.
I mean, not all, obviously, but I mean, you work at a big AI company. Would you guys open up your algorithm to governments to try to unpick what you guys are actually doing?
I mean, what would be the purpose there? Because I don't think anyone would have the first idea.
Well, I think that's the point. Is like, I mean,
Yeah.
I've covered tech, but it's incredibly hard for kind of most people to understand any of this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So one argument would be that you need to open up what the black box is to try to kind of develop some sort of relationship with government. But as we know in the States, at least, there's a lot of resistance to government regulation around some
But
of
you
this
raise a good point, and that's the sort of question that somebody who had a decent understanding of technology might ask. I don't think
Like me, yeah.
Exactly,
I don't get
but I
it,
don't
but,
think
yeah.
any, let's say, politicians with just a rudimentary understanding of this,
Yeah.
I don't think anyone would have any interest in that. Like, what would they do with that information? So that's why it's got to start somewhere, and then maybe there will be that push. Maybe they'll want that level of scrutiny. But right now, there's not even a chance of that.
Ben, do you want to take the other?
Yeah, on the South China Sea, I mean, I think clearly China is trying to sort of exert some sort of authority over Asia. It wants to be the preeminent power in Asia. It wants to have the ability ultimately to oversee or control the South China Sea. I don't think China has an interest in stopping all trade because China is exporting most of its goods. China's also importing a lot of its energy. China also owns a lot of ports and shipping companies and shipbuilding companies. But I think over time, the concern is more that selectively, and especially if you're a country like Japan, that China may squeeze you in terms of access to certain goods or exports of certain goods to get political concessions out of you. But I think, in a sense, that's likely to be the balance that Japan's going to have to live with. I mean, obviously, it has its own restrictions on its ability to have a military coming out of the Second World War. All their eggs are in the US basket. So it comes down to that balance of power question. But I don't think China wants to colonize Asia in any sense. Taiwan is a different question because they view it as a question of their national sovereignty. Obviously, the Taiwanese would see it differently. But I don't think China has territorial ambitions for mainland Japan or the Philippines. I think it's more about becoming the preeminent power in its own backyard. But I think that's certainly really concerning for other major economies. But the flip side is there's no way for Japan or even for Taiwan to disentangle their economies from China. They're just so deeply interconnected. So it's really about managing these risks.
And it's very interesting how China is projecting some of its power over the waters. They have a huge fleet now of Coast Guard ships. Trust me, they're not out there saving dolphins or people from drowning. These are Coast Guard ships equipped with armaments on top with the powers equivalent to an Abrams tank. So ask the Filipinos about those. They're having a very tough time.
Two more questions at the front.
Okay, two. Fred. Yep.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Damian. Thank you, first of all, for all the panel to the great discussion and excellent questions from the audience. I think my question would be initially for Abi. Coming back to this mass turn of tech leaders, sometimes 180 degrees pivot towards Trump, and especially what would you think about this? Where comes this unanimity of it? Because to me, it might suggest either it's driven by fear or by a deal being struck, or maybe it's either effectively their hope to control Trump or to help Trump control the societal sentiment, maybe in return for possibly more free-for-all development regulations on AI, and possibly maybe Bianca.
One question, sorry.
In that context, what would that mean to AI development priorities?
Okay, we had
And then at the front there.
at the front. Okay.
Thanks for trying. It seems to me there's one golden thread that runs through all of the elections of last year, which is anti-incumbency. Yes. And I think underlying that is a hugely interesting series of questions which I can't get to, but if you think about what that means, if we're in an era where governments are thrown out in the rear after 4 or 5 years, almost irrespective of how good, how well they're performing, what does that say about us in terms of polarization, in terms of a fragmenting of our democratic ideals? Because it seems to me that if we can't trust one another or trust our governments for any more than a very short period of time, it has profound implications for long-term building society.
Yeah, and I just quickly add not only anti-incumbency, but anti-perceived establishment as well. And we'll start with you.
First one?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I'd just say I don't think there is unanimity. I think it's clear. I mean, and I think maybe that was a mistake that people made even about Silicon Valley in the past, thinking it was all democratic leaning. Actually, there are variances in that. So I think there is a little bit more of a variance. I think probably to some extent there are some that clearly believe some of this stuff. I think we've reported at the Times that Mark Zuckerberg's switch politically had happened long before the current election. He'd got tired of the blowback he was getting from the left around technology and some of his causes. And also there is a genuine view among some tech CEOs that the Biden administration and prior to that, the second Obama administration, really didn't get tech, really went into and really constrained their ability to innovate and do business. There certainly is probably some bit of it whereby they think it's a way of making your life easier under a Trump administration by being closer to him. But there are variations in that. So some CEOs, Meta's Mark Zuckerberg, has done a very vocal about turn. Jeff Bezos was at the DealBook Summit last month talking about how he was very optimistic about Trump and would try to help convince him that the mainstream media wasn't the enemy. But others, like Tim Cook, who I think is probably one of the most successful at managing that relationship, have been very quiet about it. In the first administration, he quietly established a good relationship with Trump. He would speak to him. He made a big flashy announcement about big investment in the US. And yet, as Ben pointed out, they are one of the most embedded US companies in China. So how did he maintain that? Similarly, if you saw him yesterday, he wasn't at the front of the thing. He was kind of being quietly, he was there, he was present for his company. So there was certainly some degree of needing to be part of that conversation. And I think you're probably right. There is a degree to which, maybe there will be cases where it could benefit them in terms of regulation elsewhere. Certainly Mark Zuckerberg has talked about, I was struck in his statement announcing the end of fact-checking, saying, we're going to partner with the government to protect American interests, which isn't normally the kind of thing you expect a CEO of a global company to do. So I think there are lots of implications for that, and I'm sure Ben has a thought.
Just on the incumbency question, I'll be really wary about overgeneralizing about democracies in very different countries. If you look at the world's biggest democracy, India, Modi was re-elected, his majority was slightly reduced. If you look at the world's third biggest democracy, third most populous, Indonesia, there was a new president, but he was very much backed by the outgoing president who was term limited. In Taiwan, the DPP, the ruling party, won the presidential election. They lost control of the parliament. So I think you can't overgeneralize. If you look at the US, obviously Biden and Harris were sort of uniquely bad combination and bad timing in the way they handled everything. So I just don't think you can generalize on those questions.
Okay. As they like to say in TV land, we're about to lose our satellite feed. So I want to do one more round, minute or less. 2025, let's leave our esteemed guests with something positive, which you expect or might happen in the coming year. Rafi?
Right. It's just kind of positive. I think the one thing that's happened now is transparency. I think I think we have all these assumptions about the way the world works, and I think what my point about the way CEOs and business leaders have kind of come around to Trump is there's a little bit more clarity about motivations. One CEO I remember saying, we as business journalists mistake how we assess their approach to the world. It's not just about necessarily values, it's about reading the room. And ultimately, I think if we kind of figure that out, it might inform how we kind of think about some of the big questions in the next 4 years.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd say if you want something exciting, look at some of the big fast-growing economies in Asia. India, Philippines, Vietnam, all going to probably grow more than 6% a year. Indonesia and others doing really well, like really fast adoption of new technologies. They're leapfrogging ahead in many different things. Loads of really interesting apps coming up. A lot of potential for AI and other digital public infrastructure, they call it in India, to kind of fix societal problems. And maybe a lot of things we in the old world, the declining world, can learn as well from some of those adoption of new technologies.
I would say that notwithstanding my generalized remarks about the standard of knowledge of AI among politicians and some in the media, what is exciting, as your question demonstrated as well, is more people are getting engaged and involved in the discussion, and not just seeing AI as ChatGPT or a filter, because it is becoming more of an invisible thread that's woven throughout our main industries, and it will be impacting our democracies. And certainly for my part, and what I would like to see, is more technology companies meeting people in the middle and trying to democratize the information, be involved in debates like these and discussions, so that we can have more public participation talking about technologies that are reshaping all of our lives. So that would be my hope for 25.
Thank you. Robert?
I'm gloom neutral on this. I have three things. I'm an old-fashioned journalist. I don't think narrative is dead, and the narrative goes on. One of the big things in the narrative that I want to know is what's going to happen to the Russian economy in the second half of this year. Can it really, the signs are not good, but it is incredibly resilient. Attached to that, which we haven't discussed at all, is how is Europe and Western Europe going to organize itself? Because this is where Trump isn't joking, and one really can understand where he's coming from. What are they going to do to organize their own resilience and defense? And they're in decline. They're in big decline. You look, 2014, a little bit earlier, there was almost parity in market power between the US and the EU. Mind you, Britain was in the EU at that time. Now it is half or under. So what happens with Europe? And we have to watch the big three. And they will be very different in performance. And the big two, Germany, France, I'm not going to go there, but I'm going to go with Italy. Because why Meloni is so successful is a big question. But Meloni's approach is subtly but radically different towards Russia and Eastern Europe from the other two. To watch that. Point three, the one thing that is absolutely clear, and this is where it's right in the crosshairs for Starmer, is social welfare. The fact is that we're having to pay so much on our welfare bill, and I should have added, to go back to the very beginning of our discussion, the real shocker for me was the Dutch report, The Demography of the Netherlands Population to 2055, commissioned by the government and suppressed. And it will tell you that 65% of public budget will have to go on taking care of the elderly being over 65 by 2055, and migration and immigration is an absolute necessity. We haven't talked about immigration, but boy, we're still, again, playing checkers with that instead of looking at the three-dimensional chess that it really is. Thank you. I think we'll get that one right there.
Ravi, Ben, Bianca, Robert, thank you so much. If I could leave a note like this, is we're all of us on this panel connected in one way or another to journalism, so please continue to support journalists in the media industry, whether it's just subscribing to a Substack newsletter, paying for a physical newspaper, paying for an online subscription,
the big issue,
or supporting journalist organizations like Committee to Protect Journalists or Reporters Without Borders. Journalism has become one of the biggest, one of the most dangerous professions in the world. And finally, don't feel powerless. There are things you can do as well, aside from, for example, voting. You can, for example, volunteer for various organizations. And I say this because in the world where I live right now, in Ukraine and neighboring states, NGOs are being designated as illegal organizations or foreign-owned organizations. It's very difficult for them to operate. And also don't forget that if you want to raise your voice, get involved in campaigns. But I'm going to add one more thing. The opinion pages of various online or physical newspapers are open to you. Use that resource to put your arguments forward. Lastly, thank you so much for coming. You can.
Which is very, very important, and I'm giving more and more time to it. Sorry, it's not about me. Schools and kids. Do encourage schools and children up to students, to take journalism seriously and discuss it. I'm going into endless schools where, thank God they say you've come. It's not like Livingston meeting Stanley, but I've been in several schools, exactly, where you discuss Gaza, you discuss Ukraine, because they're not allowed to discuss it in their own discussion groups. And by the way, if you're in London, I'm absolutely a free fire zone. I'm willing to go to any school to talk to kids from
Fantastic.
10 years on about why news and information, as you have said, is so important.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And we have a small gift from the